The Europeans are perfectly willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, but you don't see anybody from Europe going there to fight. Russia was too big, too powerful relative to Ukraine. Ukraine was destined to lose in a long war. And the United States basically shoved NATO expansion down the Russians' throat.
John Mearsheimer insists that the war in Ukraine is still a lost cause. 3 years into it, why the United States shouldn't deal in this madness anymore, this proxy war against a nuclear power, and should actually withdraw all aid now. He also gets into some truth about how the war actually began and the fortuitous nature of this war 3 years in, when so much territory has been lost, over 1 million Ukrainians dead, and all for nothing. So let's get right into it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Let's talk about NATO expansion. Bill Clinton decides 1994 that he's going to expand NATO eastward. The Russians are adamantly opposed. In 1999, we have the first wave of expansion. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic come in. The Soviets scream, bloody murder. They do not want NATO expansion. We just shove it down their throat. Why do we shove it down their throat? Because they're weak. Same thing happens in 2004. Second big tranche of NATO expansion. This is when the Baltic states, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania come in to the alliance. The Russians again scream bloody murder. We shove it down their throat. And then in 2008, we say that Ukraine and Georgia will become part of NATO. And the Russians say this is not going to happen. But we do not back off because we think the Russians are weak and we can shove it down their throat again. But my general point to you here is that when you're weak in the international system, the more powerful great powers will take advantage of you. The United States is a ruthless great power. And the United States basically shoved NATO expansion down the Russians' throat until the war in Georgia in August 2008, and then, of course, the Ukraine war.
Yeah, Mearsheimer's exactly right about this. This NATO expansion crusade was a duplicitous violation of agreements that the United States made with Gorbachev to dissolve the Soviet Union. James Baker, the Secretary of State, told Gorbachev, and we know this from the minutes, they confirm it, we will not move the NATO alliance 1 inch to the east. And this was not just a one-time thing. This was said multiple times. Scott Horton, reveals the truth about this in his great book, Provoked. But there's a great site on this, the National Security Archive, that gets into this here. And not only was that the case, a promise from James Baker that was repeated multiple times from American officials, we had the German ambassador, Jürgen Krobag, under the leadership of Hans Dietrich Genscher, actually repeat the same thing, and not only say that, but, going further than that, to say that that means Poland and other countries east of Germany can't be part of NATO. No new countries inside of NATO. That was what they said to the east of Germany. This isn't just a conspiracy theory. This is the truth. It's well documented, and the minutes actually reflect that. So Mearsheimer's right.
In fact, the Ukraine crisis, which broke out in February of 2014, and then the war, of course, broke out in February of 2022. But again, in a system where there's no higher authority and you can't be certain that another state won't attack you, and that might be a very powerful state, you have a vested interest in being as powerful as possible. And every state understands this logic. So you have this intense security competition that takes place. Does this make me happy? No. It's tragic. But it's a situation where the structure of the system leaves those states with no choice.
Yeah, this was a part of U.S. behavior in the foreign policy realm that was backward, if you ask me, in the unipolar moment when the United States was the only superpower in the world. Seems like that was a fleeting moment based on the behavior of the United States, basically in foreign policy, by the way. But in that moment, they decided to expand the U.S. empire into Eastern Europe through NATO expansion and through arming these countries with NATO weaponry all the way up to Ukraine's border. And then when they overthrew the Yanukovych government in Ukraine in 2014, that put no buffer between that alliance and Russia. This was intolerable to Russia. You might say, I don't care. Well, the United States would care if Russia did this in Mexico, overthrew the Mexican government, replaced it with a one friendly to Russia, and then putting, dual-purpose missiles that could launch warheads, nuclear warheads, on the United States border with Mexico. That would be the analogous situation.
Tragedy of great power politics.
So since we are in the European Union right now and in the European Parliament, I want to talk a bit about this conflict, the Ukraine conflict. So a lot of the members here, the majority of the members, they want to support Ukraine in every way possible. We send, now we're buying weapons from the Americans for the war and all this stuff. So, and what they say is because we need to defend the Ukraine's right to defend itself. We need to fight for the right for Ukraine to defend itself. Well, I want you to comment on this. This is exactly what is happening here in this house.
Well, the truth is that the Europeans cannot do much to help the Ukrainians. And the end result is that the Ukrainians are going to lose. And I believe many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are going to die. It would have been much better if people here in Europe and people in the United States had recognized in February of 2014 that they were flirting with disaster by supporting Ukraine, that Europe and the United States helping Ukraine was not going to allow Ukraine to defeat Russia.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to be clear, the Europeans, to the extent of Poland, has sent thousands of troops into Ukraine. They have kind of stopped that caused too much political controversy because, their people don't want to put up with this empire building nonsense either. And Ukraine has lost hundreds of thousands of people in this war. Most projections over 1 million people at this point. There's different projections on how many each side has lost, but many of them are north of 1 million for the Ukrainians. It was a disaster that didn't have to happen, brought about the United States intervention in overthrowing the Yanukovych government in 2014. Sorry, that wasn't just an organic revolution. There were critics of Yanukovych in Ukraine. But U.S. aid, the financial wing of the CIA, pumped billions of dollars into Ukraine at that time to aid efforts to displace Yanukovych and to replace him with a regime that was bellicose toward Russia. That is the truth that you don't hear on U.S. corporate news media whatsoever, and that's what caused the beginning of this conflict stage. Now, there was NATO expansion before that. That was only asking for conflict, but 2014 is when the conflict truly began. That's when the war truly began.
Russia was too big, too powerful relative to Ukraine. Ukraine was destined to lose in a long war. So the European leaders here in Brussels and across Europe should have understood a long time ago that it was in Ukraine's interest and in Europe's interest to end the war. And that continuing the war was a prescription for disaster because the Russians are just much more powerful.
Yeah, and to be clear, again, people will say he's a loon. Putin invaded and it was unprovoked. No, Putin invaded in the 8th year of a civil war between forces in Ukraine that didn't want to be a part of Ukraine, that voted via plebiscites that they wanted to be part of Russia, and Crimea, a referendum there where 97% of the populace said, we want to be Russian, we don't want to be Ukrainian. And the U.S. funded the Ukrainian side as if they were a NATO power. It was a de facto NATO power at that point, running joint military exercises there. And the Ukrainian government, violated the Minsk Accords. The Ukraine government was supposed to give the Donbas region political autonomy, not unlike, Hong Kong or another administrative region like that, for basic political sovereignty outside of the Ukrainian government. They violated that, and they shelled villages in the Donbass. That's what we have here. It wasn't started by Putin. It was started by empire-building schemes by the U.S. and NATO.
And the Europeans, first of all, the Europeans are not going to fight and die. The Europeans are perfectly willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, but you don't see anybody from Europe going there to fight. And in terms of giving the Europeans armaments, weapons to fight Russia with, the Europeans and the Americans cannot produce enough weapons to match the number of weapons that the Russians are producing. The Russians have a formidable industrial base. This is why during most of the war, people have argued that Russia has an advantage in artillery somewhere in the range of 5-1, 7-1, or 10-1. Just think about that. This is a war of attrition where both sides are trying to bleed each other white, where artillery is the king of battle. Artillery.
Artillery mean weapons.
Artillery are big rounds that are shot out of a tube.
Okay.
Artillery rounds.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This thing's been a nightmare. Russia occupies something like 80% of the Donbass, 85 or something like that, in Luhansk and Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporizhia. And it doesn't look like they're going to be able to give up that territory. None of the $200 billion that the U.S. has sent has been able to dislodge them. Ukraine has tried to launch, offensives in 2024 into Russia to some extent, but they were beaten back and pushed back. Mearsheimer is generally right. Not a lot of Europeans are risking their lives to serve the Ukrainians in Ukraine. A lot of Poles did, though, and there was a lot of Polish deaths because of that. And there just isn't the political fortitude in many of these countries, despite what their leaders are saying, what their rulers are saying, I should say, that are part of their respective war regime, wants to continue fighting this. But Starmer and Macron and Merz are going to pay heavy prices for continuing to support this too. And the answer isn't just to create a proxy war by creating a new layer of support for Ukraine by just selling the weapons to Europe first. Then Europe gives those weapons to Ukraine. And then Ukraine uses those weapons against Russia. It doesn't serve the United States' purpose whatsoever. You're not getting out of the conflict. You're just putting an additional layer above it that keeps the U.S. involved and keeps tensions high with Russia.
And artillery is the king of battle in a war of attrition. And the conventional wisdom is throughout most of the war, from February 22nd up to the present, that Russia had an advantage on the order of 5-1, 7-1, or 10-1.
You mean people?
No, artillery.
Artillery. What is artillery?
Artillery, those are weapons.
Oh, the weapons.
Weapons,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, weapons.
Particular set of weapons. And in terms of people, I mean, the situation is disastrous now. General Syrskyi said recently, General Syrskyi, of course, is the commander of the Ukrainian forces, but he said recently that Ukraine was outnumbered overall 3-1 up on the front lines. And in certain places, certain critically important places on the battlefield, Ukraine was outnumbered 6-1.
Yeah, and remember all those propaganda stories we got in 2022 and 2023? Ukraine is winning this war. Russia is running out of artillery. They have no artillery production. They can't keep up. Well, that turned out to be a flat lie. It was designed to propagandize Americans into supporting more aid to Ukraine, that this was somehow winnable to the extent that you can hold on to the Donbass. It hasn't proven that to be the case. Not whatsoever.
And Zelensky recently said that in Pokrovsk, where a big battle is now being fought, that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians 8-1. This is soldiers we're talking about. And I was talking about artillery before. That's weaponry. And you're talking about huge advantages for the Russians. So the Ukrainians are at a tremendous disadvantage. And the Americans are no longer helping, right? The Americans have shifted the burden to the Europeans. And the Europeans, of course, are perfectly willing to try to continue to support Ukraine. But it's going to be increasingly difficult for the Europeans because they're not going to have monetary help from the United States. And plus, these European economies are all having real problems.
Yeah, I'll just generally agree with Mearsheimer there. The only thing is that the United States hasn't really completely shifted the burden to the Europeans in this war. There's still $30 billion set to be transferred from the United States to Ukraine in this war. Trump made it a point to say during the campaign he was going to end this war day one. It's just another one of Trump's best promises on the campaign trail that has been broken in his second term, certainly so. There was that time when Zelensky went to the White House, I think in March, and there was that big spat between the two. Seems like it was performative to some extent, with Trump shutting down aid to Ukraine for something like 6 days, but then it was quickly restored in favor of this minerals deal that was on the table, which was absurd anyways and totally stupid to even entertain because the minerals that Trump was supposedly relying on as part of this deal were under Russia-occupied territory in the east, the mineral-rich regions of the east, that is the Donbass, that is Russian-occupied. And that was the reason that the U.S. restored all of this aid. Look, both the liberal establishment and MAGA has treated this war in the same way. And it was really treated the same way in Trump's first term when he was giving Ukraine the first offensive weapons that Obama wouldn't even give Ukraine back then, despite certainly being on board with this whole empire building quest in Eastern Europe. Trump gave them to the Ukrainians and then boasted about them. The javelins, Obama wouldn't give them the javelins, look at what I did. And Trump withdrew from the INF treaty unilaterally. Didn't please the Russians. He slapped new sanctions on Russia. He blasted them for giving Snowden safe haven. And what did you see in media headlines during that time in the United States? Russiagate. Trump colluding with Putin, despite the fact he's arming Ukraine to the teeth. That was a propaganda scheme designed not only to undermine Trump for specious reasons, and he should be undermined for legitimate reasons, he's a war criminal, but also to inflame tensions with Russia. It accomplished at least the latter part of that. Certainly so. You still see this propaganda repeated. 11 months into Trump's term and he's still a Russian asset. Yeah, sorry. The American people aren't buying that as the United States arms Ukraine to the teeth, even under an America First administration. Imagine that. Duplicity from Trump, broken promises, such as the story of his second term, where the best promises are broken and the worst promises are kept, as they always are. But I'm with Mearsheimer here. This is a lost cause. The United States isn't, threatened by Russia whatsoever. They don't want a war with us. They want a war with us to the extent that Iran wanted a war with us. They don't. It doesn't make any sense to have a proxy war versus a would-be trading partner that actually wanted warm relations with the United States at first. Putin started out to be pretty pro-United States, but look at what the United States did in this mad empire-building experiment that involved NATO expansion, overthrowing a government on their border, and inserting an anti-Russian government in its place. That's what the Maidan Revolution was. They call it the revolution of dignity, but it was actually the revolution of duplicity. And we know that from leaked conversations between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador there, talking about who had to be part of this provisional government such that it would be adversarial toward Russia. We knew that when John McCain and Lindsey Graham went over there and said, 2014 and 2014 is going to be the year of aggression against Russia. They might have done that in 2015 instead of 2014, but they were there shortly thereafter, rattling sabers in a war against Russia that they or their kin would never fight in. It's never them. They never commit their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honors to these wars like the Founding Fathers did in the Declaration of Independence. They ask others to fight that war for their own ambitions and their empire-building schemes. But what do you think? Is Mearsheimer right? Does the United States need to pull out of Ukraine completely? Is Trump just completely won over by the military-industrial complex in this regard, in terms of the Israel lobby? Let me know in the comments down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Fidian, great podcast. Thanks for having Mearsheimer on. The whole conversation was great. Take a look at that. Also, if you like this video, please consider becoming a YouTube member. You can do that by clicking the join button below. And if you do so, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. You'll have immediate access to those members only videos. And until I see you guys next time, one thing, if you want a free copy of my book, Compact of the Republic, click the link in the description below, plug in your email, I'll send that right to you free of charge. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.